Welcome to the Keeping IT Real podcast. This podcast features honest and transparent conversations about what it takes to manage corporate technology and expenses today. Each episode, listen to true and personal stories from IT professionals who are working hard to make sure their business stays connected and competitive. I'm your host, Jethro Castillo, and let's meet our next guest. Today, I am joined by Hyoun Park, the CEO and Principal Analyst at Amalgam Insights, a research firm dedicated to help organizations make financially responsible IT decisions. Hyoun is well known as a top industry analyst in the IT expense management space with over 20 plus years of experience in career billing and enterprise IT. Hyoun, along with his company Amalgam Insights, aims to provide the information and resources companies need to cut technology costs, form strategic business cases, and create ROI. Hyoun is someone I very much look up to, and so I consider it a great honor to have him on the podcast. And Hyoun, thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks so much.
So I introduced you, but I think you know yourself better than I do. So why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Oh, sure. So again, I'm Hyoun Park. I am an industry analyst here at Amalgam Insights, a firm that I started about 7 years ago, really to focus on two areas. One is, of course, the company is called AI, so I look at AI. But the other part that I look at is IT cost management, which is an area that I have covered for 16 years total as an industry analyst. And prior to that, I spent almost 10 years working on telecom and related software and network expenses, both at the enterprise level and at the vendor level. So I've spent most of my professional career looking at these costs.
You had a lot of history in the IT space, like you mentioned. How did you eventually find yourself in the analyst space instead of being in the weeds, if you will, of IT?
Yes,
you still are in the weeds.
Right. I feel like I spent most of my 20s learning the craft. Coming out of college, I had no real training in telecom expenses or data or payments or vendor relations or all of these other areas that are core to technology expense management. But over the years, as I got to work with companies like McDonald's and handling their telecom bills, and then on the flip side, moving to the enterprise side and working at Bose and at Teradyne, managing their telecom and cell phone and networking conferencing bills, I realized that I needed a better understanding of how this entire ecosystem worked if I wanted to advance my career. So as part of that, I started reading other people's research, every news article I could read on best practices and vendors. Basically, I did my research, just as we all learn to research things that we really care about. And for me, that meant reading the key reports that existed in my market. But as I started reading these reports, frankly, at the time, we're talking late 2000s, the stuff I was reading felt very out of date. And being in my early 30s with 10 years experience and having a liberal arts background where I wrote papers all the time in college, I felt like I could get into this space and frankly do a better job of providing advice and in analyzing these companies. So I decided to throw my hat into the ring and applied to an analyst firm called the Aberdeen Group, which was very strong at technology and telecom expenses at the time. In fact, they had hired a guy named Joe Basili, who currently runs the Enterprise Technology Management Association. He was my predecessor in that role. So they had built out this practice, and I basically came into this company and I learned how to become an analyst. I had already known how technology expense management worked, but I needed to learn how to do that as an analyst and how to build out my personal brand and how to do all of the outward facing, market facing, front end aspects that were associated with being an analyst to take the next step forward. So that was how I got started being an analyst and to stop doing real work and just watch other people do work.
How did the transition to creating Amalgam Insights happen? And you created kind of your own analyst organization rather than being an analyst under a different organization.
Yeah. So what I found over time from a business perspective is that I was having trouble finding analyst firms that wanted to focus on this IT expense world and that wanted to be future facing. I kept running into companies that wanted to be kind of legacy in nature. They wanted to stick to the one thing they were good at and just stay there forever. And although that's great if you want to work somewhere for 20 years and do the same thing and have something that is guaranteed, that's never been really my raison d'etre for working. I've always been trying to find new opportunities and new things to build. I kind of have experience with doing this. I when I got my MBA back in 2010, one of the reasons I did is that I wanted to know how to do what I call running my own lemonade stand, which means knowing how to open a lemonade stand, keep it open, make sure you get all your permits, and make sure you can run this thing going forward. And once you learn that skill, you find that basically anything you can do from a business perspective, you can run as your own business. So I wanted to do that. And then in 2017, I got my chance to finally open my own firm.
You mentioned you throw your hat into the ring. But from what I understand, the analyst space, that ring is pretty crowded, right? You have a lot of people in big organizations, Gartner, Forrester,
Right.
ETMA, all of these kind of have a huge sort of advantage, but also a lot of sort of they take up a lot of space in that ring, if you will. How did you, realize I want to enter this market, if you will? And then how did you compete and ultimately succeed in a space that can feel kind of crowded?
Yes. So in the space, obviously, when you start looking at analyst firms as a tech company, you're going to run into Gartner, Forrester, maybe IDC, maybe S&P Global, some of these companies that have hundreds or even thousands of analysts. And I would say it's not unlike, say, the food world, where if you start a restaurant, you immediately have to compete in some way with either McDonald's and Wendy's, or maybe like the steakhouses like Morton's and Ruth Chris's. There's a lot of great options out there, and you have to figure out what you make that is better or different. And typically, trying to make a better hamburger than every single other hamburger place out there is not going to work very well. So you have to start by knowing, how are you different? And for me, it has always come back to understanding the cost and expense management of technology. It is an area that I both am passionate about and really have dug into for my entire career. But for some reason, everybody else in technology likes to focus just on the actual technical aspects of dealing with the widgets and the bits and the bytes, which I also acknowledge is important. And it is a piece of the puzzle, but it never really covers the dollars. And I like to follow the money. So I find that differentiation has been very important for me in both in running my company as well as just being an analyst and differentiating myself. Because when I talk about data, it's always in context of the money. When I'm talking about networks, always in context of the money. When I'm talking about any technology that I'm looking at, there's always a dollars and cents focus of managing that vendor and controlling those costs and controlling the contracts and figuring out how to play those internal politics within your company associated with budget allocation that my colleagues mostly have not focused on, because they are more focused on understanding whether this database is this relational database, how quickly it inputs and outputs data, and the extent to which it supports specific APIs, and all of these other things that are important from a functional perspective, but don't cover the business relationship with IT.
Well, that is exactly what we're going to be talking a lot about today, TEM. So thanks for the really easy transition. Would you say that that's where most of your professional audience comes from, technology expense management?
Yes, I would. Because I've been doing this consistently for 16 years, and I've been covering this in a variety of ways, be it benchmark reports, social media, pretty much everything across the board. I've tried to keep up with trends as they come up. So if it's YouTube, be on YouTube. If it's Instagram, be on Instagram. If it's blogging, of course, have the blog. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, because when I started my career 16 years ago, being an analyst was really just about surveying people and writing up the results in a 50-page report and then throwing it out there. And then people would give you $10,000 for that data. But honestly, that business model is dead. Data is much more available. It's much easier to survey people now. There's all sorts of reasons that business model doesn't work the same way anymore. And that's fine as long as you can find. And so I had to figure out other ways to explore the market and find new trends, and by talking to people, by digging more deeply into financial reports, doing all these different things that I have access to. And by doing that, I was able to continue being an analyst in this technology expense management space. But I feel that technology expense management has really been my bread and butter. It's funny because when I came out of college in the late 90s, probably the technology that I had most experience with was machine learning, because I had done some computational chemistry as well in college. And when you're trying to figure out how to build a protein or fit some sort of conformational piece of something into something else from a drug interaction perspective, that's a computational chemistry problem, which ends up being a machine learning problem. So I had to learn a little bit of math to do that. And when I came out of college, I thought that was going to be my most useful skill, because I had this complex math that I had learned and it was going to be useful in the business place. And then I entered the actual business world and I realized nobody actually uses this stuff in the real world, except for some very specific technical use cases that you need PhDs for. So when I found that my most complex skills were basically useless in the workplace, I had to kind of take steps down and figure out, where do I go in terms of managing data or being able to sort data in a way that is actually business worthy. And I got to technology expense management, which has been a really nice combination of being able to look at new technologies, understand the money, and then deal with the data associated with it. It's a good fit for the types of things that I personally like doing.
So I feel like the world has caught up to you now. Machine learning is kind of is here.
Yeah, and now AI is super popular. Obviously, the past 2 years have been just an evolution and revolution for AI. But love it or hate it, it's there. Like even my mom asks me about AI now, and she certainly did not do that 5 years ago.
So you did it before it was cool. So I guess you're kind of, I don't know if there's any like, well, why wasn't this here 20 years ago when I was actually learning about it?
Yeah, it would have been way more useful for getting a job way back then if people had known what AI was, sure. But things happen in their own time. You have to, just because you think something is cool doesn't mean that everybody else is going to agree, unfortunately. That's what I found.
I guess you can say you're ahead of your time, which is always a cool thing to say after the fact. So
yeah, I don't know how useful it is, to be honest, but yeah, sure.
All right. So TEM, now known as technology expense management, and we'll jump into the now known part of that later. What exactly are we talking about when we say technology expense management?
From a practical perspective, I think of technology expense management as looking at cloud computing, hardware, software, network, telecom, and mobility and Internet of Things. Those tend to be the areas that come up most often. And managing all of those areas and costs is the basis of technology expense management. So you've got to handle those bills. You've got to make sure those bills are accurate and aligned to your contracts. You've got to get those payments into your vendors and make sure they're not late. And then you use this data to figure out what your next contract should look like and to align your technology portfolio to your business needs. I see all of that as part of expense management. So perhaps expense is not the most the biggest umbrella term that could be used for this, as we are really talking about understanding the business relationship between technology and the business at the end of the day. But the tactical part of that honestly starts with looking at your bills, paying them, and understand what you're paying for in relation to how your business works.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think there's a little bit of, there's that idea that technology expense management, or TEM, is no longer sexy. Expense management isn't sexy, but like you had just mentioned, it almost limits itself to what it actually could be or is. And it's, like you said, that business relationship. And so I guess we use TEM, and that's pretty colloquial, synonymous now. That's not the right phrase, but it's the phrase that is used. Is there something more? I don't want you to have to say, oh, what I do is I study the relationship, and I analyze the relationship, the business relationship between tech and the business. What is there a better phrase than technology expense management for what you're trying to sort of inform the audience?
So I always struggle with this, because I feel that both telecom expense management and technology expense management have been around as phrases for technology for a decade, telecom for probably 2 decades plus. So those are established phrases, but I am intrigued with the way that FinOps has been emerging as a phrase, and as the FinOps Foundation, which has been focused mainly on cloud computing costs, but has also started to look at software costs. So I feel like they are working their way towards unified communications, and eventually they'll realize that there's also this network and telecom thing going on that makes up $1 trillion of global technology spend that dwarfs everything else that they are looking at. And, someday they will get there. But I feel that in general, that FinOps piece might end up being more trendy in the next few years. It's not that we're talking about doing anything really different, because when you look at the steps that FinOps is built around, it's about building out your inventory, making sure you're paying your vendors, making sure that you are managing your contracts correctly, making sure that you are getting the right terms for all of your products and services. Things that are taken for granted in TEM are now FinOps principles, and now everybody in the cloud is learning these things and they're excited about it, because they finally have a way of controlling their cloud costs. But they're the exact same things that we've been talking about in TEM for many years. It's just that for some reason, our discussions never penetrated the cloud architect team. And now that it's called FinOps instead and has a little bit of lipstick and shine on it, all of a sudden it seems to be different, which is fine. I think the most important part is getting the best practices to people, and for everyone to save money and do better with their financial management of technology. Whether it's called TEM or FinOps at the end of the day isn't really a big deal for me, as much as making sure that we are continuing to do the right things. If we end up calling this telecom FinOps at the end of the day instead of TEM, I really don't care all that much. I think that bigger challenge is for perhaps vendors like VCOM or other companies that have to figure out how to market and communicate their value proposition. But these changes are happening. If you look at the SaaS world, the software as a service world, they tend to talk about SaaS management instead of SaaS expense management or SaaS FinOps. And so every piece of technology seems to have their own phrase that they're using to describe their expense management strategies, which is a little unfortunate from confusion perspective.
Yeah, for sure. It'll all come out in the wash, I guess, is the saying. Like you said, it's almost better late than never. Sure, they're calling it something else, and it's more, more shine, more lipstick. But as long as people get to come around to being able to save money,
Mm-hmm.
and provide better value to their business. That's all that matters. You did mention, technology expense management, but then you also said telecom expense management. Both are TEM.
Yes.
And I think it recently, like you said, 2 decades, 1 decade, recently it's evolved into technology expense management. Could you walk me through that history of TEM, why it originated, how it originated as telecom expense management, and how it's evolved to today?
Sure. So, back when I started working about quarter century ago when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I feel like telecom and network were really the dominant IT cost. Back in those days, your Cisco certification was basically gold in being able to work in an IT department. And your network and telecom costs were far larger than your software costs or even your server costs. So that was the basis of it. That back when telecom expense management was emerging and became a really big deal in the 2000s, telecom was half your IT spend. So, of course, you had to pay attention to that. Every CIO wanted to figure out how to manage those costs. And there's a lot of detail once you started getting into things like call accounting, where you saw every call that was coming in and out of your office, or network performance, where you were able to start looking at each packet that was coming in and out of your network and how fast everything was going. Being able to align those things to the direct costs of each circuit and each phone line and each phone and each voicemail box, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that goes into your corporate phone environment, that was all really challenging. And so TEM became really important in the 2000s. And then in the 2010s, I would say that telecom expense management became mature, and the challenge went from being able to define telecom expense management to going down to the mid-market, because the Fortune 500 had all already figured out that they needed it. But it was starting to go downstream to these companies that had, call it 1 to 10 million or 1 to 20 million in annual spend, that also needed these management tools, but couldn't necessarily pay the $1 million cost for the Fortune 500 version of the solution. So one challenge was going to mid-market. And then the second challenge was that telecom was starting to shrink as a proportion of the IT budget, because this thing called software started taking off. And there started becoming an app for everything, as Apple called it. And that happened both in the personal world and in the business world, as we started going from having perhaps 10 or 20 apps in the business that we really worked with to 100 to 200. Currently, if you look at your average billion-dollar enterprise, they have over 1,000 apps that they have to manage. So software became a problem. And then, of course, with Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, we also saw cloud becoming a big thing. Obviously, everything that happens across the board with storage and compute and AI and databases and all of the services that are on AWS and Azure and Google Cloud are all big deals now. And they also have very similar granular transactional billing challenges, similar to the individual calls, the individual texts, the individual transactions and packets that have defined costs in the telecom and network world. So now that we have to look at cloud with the same granularity that we look at telecom and network, now there's this need for this expanded expense management capability from an IT perspective. So now we've gone from looking at telecom expense management to a broader technology expense management world, as software and hardware have become more granular and harder to manage, frankly.
TEM has been here for a long time, like you said, and it has evolved as technology's evolved, and it doesn't just encompass what it used to encompass, it encompasses so much more. With all of this kind of existing for so long, it feels like a buzzword that has long passed almost. It should be a priority, but it's not the top priority for a lot of people as new technologies are arising. So why is TEM still worth talking about now? What is the goal of taking the time to invest in good technology expense management?
I think there's two really big areas where TEM can help companies today from a strategic perspective. The first is that telecom and communications have always fundamentally been ways for people to talk to each other, and has been a way to understand the flow of communication and understanding within a business. So every time you make a complex business sale, you have a number of calls and texts and other communications that happen, and emails. So what is the cost of perhaps a sale? That is something that you can understand from a communications perspective by looking at something like telecom expense management, or understanding how much of your communications internally is needed to make a team productive versus what might be too much or what might be too little. These might be things that you might also be able to analyze by looking at the combination of call usage and the cost of being able to support those calls. Maybe there's a very easy way to make sure you have X amount of minutes or X amount of people involved in the same team, and just being able to get them the right unified communications accounts to make sure that they are able to keep in touch with each other, or the right devices to keep in touch with each other. These are all things that you can take a look at from a TEM perspective. A second one is obviously there's been a lot of focus on the contact center and customer experience, and a lot of that is still phone-based or network-based in some way. And looking at the network traffic and phone calls and activity associated with the customer experience and internal help desk, and understanding the costs associated with that is also very important. And I feel like those two fundamental areas are at least things that should be considered from a TEM perspective. I agree that the phrase TEM it's a well-known phrase, and for a lot of CIOs who've been looking at this line item for 20, maybe 30 years even, they might just be tired of seeing it, but it doesn't change the fact that network and communications and collaboration are still fundamental activities in the business that requires some sort of tracking and analysis if you're going to do this in a productive fashion. And I also feel that a lot of companies take for granted that because they figured out a way to optimize their traffic 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, that they are up to date, when they don't realize that plans have changed, usage patterns have changed, different options for using phone or voice in applications rather than directly through a phone system obviously exist. If you aren't thinking about things like WhatsApp in your enterprise, you're just not living in a modern world. So all these different options exist, and you have to continually optimize based on the newest technologies that are available. So I think TEM is still relevant, but it can be hard for people to understand the full extent of how TEM is relevant when they are thinking of it as perhaps still a landline technology or something that they used 10 or 15 years ago to optimize one piece of their communications environment, rather than the entirety as people typically look at it today in a modern perspective.
Right. Just as technology evolves, the way you manage I guess if we're using the phrase, the way you manage the expenses of those technologies also has to change and evolve as well. And to me, it's kind of just like you have a really bad analogy is you have a dirty house and you clean it once, right? Fully, deep clean. That's your optimization. You have this clean house, but over the course of time, you buy new things. You wake up, you cook, you change clothes, you create more mess. And if you don't keep up with the cleanliness of that mess, it will pile up again until suddenly you're way more inefficient with how you operate around your house, that you have to do another deep clean. And if you continuously do it constantly, then it never piles up and it becomes a very manageable thing over time. But if you drop the habit of cleaning your house
that can creep up on you, and before you know it, it's a mess that might be too large to handle, and you have no idea where anything is. You have no idea how much money you're losing, and you don't know how to make better decisions. You don't know what you need to buy because you don't know where things are at in your house. I guess that analogy is more perfect than I realized. So
Yeah, actually it is. I believe very much in the power of entropy. If you do not put concerted effort into doing something, entropy will take over. Things will slow down. Chaos will come in. Things will get messier. People will fall into their lazy habits, and that's just human. That if you do not work on improving and building things, things will fall apart, inherently so. That's just how life works. It's easy to break things. It's hard to build things, but building things and keeping things clean or even pristine is the bigger challenge. And it is an ongoing challenge in technology expense management as well, probably with the home as well. And probably it's something that both have in common is that in the technology expense world, if you do an audit, usually all the savings from that audit are, and all the cleanup will be wiped out within 2 years. Probably true for your house as well. That after 2 years, any remnants of a deep clean will be long gone.
For the next question, I'm going to continue this analogy, and then I'll probably drop the analogy. But when we clean a house, that is not the ends, right? That is the means, and there's a bigger end to optimizing cleaning your house. That's peace of mind. That's also, okay, I can see now what I already have and what I don't have. So, we're out of Kleenex. I know I can buy Kleenex because I know for a fact I don't have it. And so it allows me to make better decisions in the future. It allows me to know what I have. And all in all, it helps me save money for my house and save mindset. So that being said, cleaning the house leads to a much bigger goal, not just to have a house clean. So once proper temp is established and continues to be optimized, what else is possible from an executive and strategic perspective? The context of this question is I want to convince my executive team that I want to invest in TEM. What can I say that is way more interesting than just TEM to make them go, okay, yeah, if we do that, then we can start to attack these other things much more effectively, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally the IT challenge is that the IT budget is, call it 3 to 4% of revenues in a standard company. You'll find verticals where it can be 10%. You'll find verticals where it can be 1%. So this is obviously a range, but on average, 3 to 4% of revenues are going to go into IT. So if you're a $100 million company, you're going to spend $4 million a year. So one of the big challenges that has come up very tactically this year is AI. Everybody wants to understand how to work with AI, but if you want to fine tune a model well, that might cost $1 million. So where are you going to find that $1 million or maybe $500,000 or $300,000 if you can target the areas that you're going to tune? Well, that's going to require a lot of cost cutting and reallocation or some creativity. And I think that's where these cost management solutions are really important because you can really understand where you can optimize. And I think the real key to IT cost management isn't just optimizing the costs and lowering that as much as you can, but understanding where you're going to reallocate those cost savings to. Yeah. You have to have some strategic target to what you want to do next. Because one of the big challenges I've seen on the CIO side is simply that somebody's handed a solution that is supposed to save them $500K, $1 million, $2 million. And the CIO says, that's great, but if I just cut that budget, I will lose that budget. And basically I will just end up cutting jobs or cutting capacity at the end of the day. So the next step is trying to figure out, what are we trying to do as a company that is more important? Are we trying to create a better digital customer experience? Are we working on AI to improve employee productivity? Are we working on a specific project to expand our operations to Europe or to Asia or to Australia or to Africa or where have you? All these things, you have to know where you're going to go next and align your IT plan over the next 2 to 3 years for what you're trying to do next. And then that's where the cost reduction is most useful, because now you have a direction to guide your department towards based on cutting the costs in these commoditized areas, being able to invest more in the current technologies that are providing the most value, and then taking a step to the future. So I feel like that's fundamentally the most important thing about TEM from an executive perspective. It is a starting point for being able to reallocate your portfolio effectively.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like that is part of the perspective shift we need to take when it comes to TEM, where it's not for the sake of cutting costs. It's for the sake of having more money to do something else that's more impactful or more interesting. It's almost a push to IT people to not just focus on how to save money, but focus on the strategic initiatives, to look at how can we provide more value, and then figuring out what can we do to cut costs so we can lead into that value. But the reason why I call it a perspective shift is because so often I've heard that IT is kind of used to be the man behind the curtain. We would just kind of do whatever the business says, keep costs low and do nothing. We're now at a stage in business where technology is almost central to every single organization. You cannot succeed or survive without technology. And so technology has a much more proactive approach to serving the business. It's not enough to just be the cost cutter. You also need to figure out how to transform that into a strategic initiative that transforms and provides more value to your organization.
Yes. And that's something that I learned earlier in my career. I remember when I moved to Teradyne, it was my first job at a large publicly traded company. And there, our job was really to be behind the curtain and just do whatever people asked us to do. And the department ran smoothly. But honestly, at one point, people talked about outsourcing the entire telecom department to an outsourced company because they felt that the work was so commoditized and there weren't very many connections with the corporate stakeholders. So after that, I moved to Bose, and I found it was the complete opposite. That when I was working with telecom expenses, I was speaking with my procurement team. I was speaking with project and portfolio management. I was speaking with the tax lawyer. I was speaking with the CFO and the controller. And I wasn't talking to all these people every week, but I would have perhaps like a quarterly update at the C-level and monthly discussions with people in governance and security and procurement and accounting about how to get things done and make our telecom relationships more efficient. And it made me realize just how much can be done through TEM, both if you're a little bit proactive and if your business wants to do other things at the end of the day with technology. And there's a lot of things that technology can do.
Yeah, no, exactly. This was an awesome conversation. Just one more sort of, and it's a kind of a very generic question, but any final thoughts from you about the space, about TEM, about where technology is headed in general?
I think there's a couple things. That first, I feel like the fundamental practices in TEM are still very much expandable to both to IT and increasingly to energy and other costs that are being managed on a subscription basis and are very granular in nature. But the devil in the details is that if you are in TEM, you do have to learn something about the new technology or the new spend category to be effective in that area. So for instance, in TEM, everybody in TEM understands how to allocate costs and look for rate optimizations. These things are just really straightforward for most of us at this point. Even if we can't do it all ourselves, we know what to ask for and we know how to manage those processes. But if you're doing that in a cloud world, you have to start learning about how infrastructure as a service and platform as a service work. You have to know how storage is managed in the same way that you understand how call detail records are managed. And honestly, there isn't that much of a difference when you think about it at a unit level. You're just talking about, is it a call or is it a kilobyte? And they end up being the same like foundational unit that you use to manage costs. But you have to learn what that foundational cost is. And I think that if TEM professionals can push themselves to take that small step, they can actually reuse all of the other skills, the harder skills that they've learned over the years, and be able to manage a variety of skills. I think that piece is important because it's part of a continuous learning mindset, and also, frankly, because I feel that sometimes people can take for granted what the breadth of capabilities that TEM professionals have. So I think TEM is still a growth space in terms of the types of management that TEM professionals can manage. It may not always be called TEM. It might sometimes be called FinOps, might be called SaaS management, might be called some sort of IT expense management thing. But the fundamental skills are still the same. On the flip side, I cover AI a lot. So I've been looking with a lot of interest at what is happening in terms of managing processes and automating processes and the extent to which AI can help with that. And I've got to be honest, I don't think 10 people have anything to worry about for the near future. The AI just can't handle the complexity of complex spend categories like IT and telecom. But I actually think this is just kind of a funny side note that when I look at AI, the thing that I think it probably does best is make executive decisions. Like I think about the work that I do just as a small business owner, and honestly, AI is better off for helping me make the CEO type decisions that I do rather than the operational decisions that I make. So CEOs out there, you might need to be more worried about a Gen AI than your standard worker at the end of the day.
Who would have thought that the job that AI is going to replace is the job that is seen as the most irreplaceable one?
Uh-huh.
You heard it here first. You heard it from an analyst. Well, Hyoun, thank you so much for your time and for being on this podcast. Like I said earlier, I really do look up to you and value what you say, but also how you think and how you approach. I think that's just probably an analyst perspective in general. Not just look at the data, but be able to translate it into business jargon, if you will, to turn it into something meaningful, turning data into value. And the way you do that is very seamless. And I guess that's what happens when you're in this space for so long and you analyze for so long. But it truly has been an honor having you on this podcast and just having a really great conversation. So I just want to thank you for taking the time and sharing everything that you have to share.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, Hyoun, take care and have a good rest of your day, your week, your month, your life.
Just like friends, your day, your week, your month, your year. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have a good one, Hyoun.
Great. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this Keeping IT Real episode, and thank you for listening. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. This podcast is all about celebrating and connecting professional heroes who work hard at IT every day. To continue the conversation and learn how VCOM can help you better buy, manage, and pay for your technology, visit us at vcomsolutions.com. Until next time.